Welcome to In the Spotlight. My guest today is Julia Figueras, music director and host-producer of Backstage Pass for 91.5 Classical and WXXI Public Broadcasting. Welcome, Julia.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you could come in. I think people are delighted to hear your work on the radio every day and on Backstage Pass. And I understand you've just won a nice award for Backstage Pass.
We did. We got into the finalist circle for the New York Festivals, which is an international radio festival. Very big players, CNN, ESPN. We lost to the New York Phil because I am not Alec Baldwin, and I get that. That's fine. But we this time around we put in a show that we did with Break of Reality, the cello percussion group. But and it was a thrill. It was a thrill. It was an honor, and we were probably the smallest entity on that finalist list, which is, to me, a huge honor, and it has been every time. We've won bronze once. This will be our second finalist award, so we're three-time winners, and every time we're the tiniest ones there, and that makes me feel great.
It goes to show that the finest art can happen in Rochester, New York, and in smaller venues. Nowadays, it doesn't have to be the New York Philharmonic.
There's a part of me that says I think some of the finest art that's happening is in smaller venues because we're fighting to stay alive, and that means that innovation is what we have to do.
And collaboration.
Innovation, collaboration is big. It's very, very big to be cross-platform, both in your presentation and with other arts groups, which is, as you know, what we really try to do at WXXI. We're reaching out. Energy from other groups brings you new energy as well.
Well, I know that WXXI features a lot of local performers, and talk more about that. Is that acknowledged procedure in your station?
It not only is it acknowledged, but we're talking about perhaps in November actually doing some kind of spotlight on local performances, where a local performance will appear in every air shift over the course of a week, maybe the whole month. But we're actually going to do a spotlight, it looks like in November, because what comes out of this city is incredible. And we're talking about, well, your Rochester Oratorio Society, Pegasus Early Music, Musica Spey. There are, and I couldn't even list them all. And we're not even talking about the groups that are performing out of the Eastman.
Or recording regularly like the Philharmonic.
Yep, exactly. And so you have everything from the East End Sax Quartet from the Eastman or Sound Exchange to the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra and the Rochester Oratorio Society. There aren't enough days to get to all the concerts for all of these wonderful groups, which is why I have Backstage Pass. Sometimes it's national, often it's local. And then we want to also do this because Carl Pulse especially is a terrific sound engineer and has been recording a lot of these, and we're getting great stuff. So let's give it an encore.
That's fantastic. So that's a very eclectic selection of programming. Is that your purview as music director?
Well, I'm the one who actually orders the CDs. And with Gene Fisher, our Vice President of Radio, we created a standard of programming, sort of some guidelines to follow.
I see.
One of the things that we really do stress, and you know, we stress this to listeners who call and say, well, I really hate that early music. Say, you know, we're a broad-based classical station, which means we have to carry everything from Hildegard of Bingen right up to John Adams. And we have to carry that spectrum all the way through. That means maybe sometimes somebody's going to hear something they don't like. My response is always the same: stay with us. You'll like the next one.
And so do you have a certain sequence for the broadcast day, say no sopranos before 10 a.m., or, you know, a certain style of music that goes with the hour of the day?
Well, there are pieces that are what we call day-parted. They're put in day parts. So there are some that, for example, aren't cleared for afternoon drive, and that would be between 4 and 6 because they're just too long.
Oh, yes, I see.
You know, you have some pieces of music that are, you know, 17-minute tone poems, and that's just too long to put into drive time, so they're not permitted there. Ditto for morning drive. And things that are really more agitated won't show up in morning. And we also have an interesting 37-minute rule. And that is because of breaks. You have to be able to get the breaks in. So there's a 37-minute-ish maximum, which can be broken. You know, if somebody comes up and says, I really, really, really want to play Mahler's Fifth, I'll say, go ahead, go ahead. Just don't play it at 7 in the morning, you know, because there's no time.
Yes.
So that's the only constraint that we have, is a time constraint.
I see.
But it is flexible. And when we did our 40 for 40 earlier this year, the top 40 is picked by our listeners. A lot of it was over 37 minutes. We have the Fauré Requiem, the Brahms Requiem, Beethoven's Night, New World Symphony, the Planets. We had an awful lot of very long pieces. So that is totally flexible.
So do you work with the individual hosts and say to them, this is what we would like you to play, or how much leeway do they have?
They have all the leeway in the world just to stay within the guidelines.
That's interesting.
So if I, however, see a piece of music that I don't think is right for a certain time of day, or maybe because there are little boxes, the host has missed the fact that it's not checked off for that time slot, I will say, that's not cleared for that time. On the other hand, a host can come to me and say, you know, I want to play this at this hour. I want to make a case for it. And if the host makes a good case, again, I'll just say, okay, fine.
So there is some personal style in the music selection, an individual taste that goes with being a host producer.
Absolutely. But we have to be very careful in what we do, because it shouldn't be Brenda's show, Julia's show, Mona's show, John's show. People have to get that sense of an arch of everything. That it feels like the day begins and it carries through smoothly to the end.
That's a lot of work for you.
So, you know, that's where the guidelines were put into place, so that we could have a sense of it's always the same station. It's just that what you might call spice will pop up, and that's often the taste of somebody.
Now, there are a lot of contracted hours on public radio stations these days, and WXXI includes broadcasts from orchestras around the country. Do you see what's on those programs and try to make your broadcast day fit with that?
Absolutely. We have a program called Music Librarian, and it's our search system. And in that search system, Mona is the one who does it. She logs in all of those performances for all of those contracted specials that we have and all the concerts that we carry. So yes, absolutely. Beethoven's Seventh gets played. It's as if it got played, and in a regular time shift too. Because you know what? Listeners do listen a long time.
They listen a long time. Agreed.
And we will hear it. We will hear it if Beethoven's Seventh shows up on Monday in a concert on Monday night, and then somebody plays it on Wednesday. We'll hear it. We'll hear someone say, what is that?
Fascinating.
Because we have very smart listeners and very attentive listeners.
That's true, and very invested listeners.
Very invested listeners.
Some of the most in the country.
Yeah, and we're very proud of that. We're very proud of that. We have a great per capita investment, and that means we're speaking well. We're speaking the language people want to hear. We also have a rotation. So for the very, very popular pieces, it's about 2 weeks. And for the somewhat less popular pieces, it's 31 days. And that's fairly solid. So if, you know, again, Beethoven's Seventh shows up on the 1st of August, that will be cleared to play probably right around, I don't know, the 15th, 16th, 17th of August. Although it's a very long symphony, so there are only a few places it can be put. But if it's something if it's In Harmonium by John Adams, that's going to show up considerably less often.
I see. And how about the overnight period? Is that taken into consideration also?
No, it is not. And it's almost impossible to take that into consideration. And we don't have enough hours in the day to log what they're playing into our system.
I see.
So we don't take that into account.
You just trust that it's a balanced show that they're sending you with enough variety over the weekend.
It's Classical 21. They do a great job. They know what they're doing in Minnesota. They do a terrific job, terrific presentation, excellent music. But again, you know, their programming standards are a little different than our programming standards. So, you know, if you hear something at 2 o'clock in the morning you don't like, please don't hold it against us.
I
You know,
see.
because we don't have any content. We have no decision over content for them. And that's always the danger.
Yeah.
Ceding your airwaves to somebody else means that you're ceding your content to them as well.
And your control over the shape of the day.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating. Now, do you audition hours? Do you say, for instance, oh, this key works well in transition to this key, and listen to a span of hours yourself? So, or how does it work that you to develop the sequence of pieces at that sort of thing?
Everybody does it differently, and so I won't speak to anybody else. Personally, I do.
Yes.
Personally, I sit down and I listen. And I listen to the beginning of something and I listen to the end of it. And I think about what the transition is going to be from one piece to another. You know, for example, I might take a beautiful, and I just did this, with a beautiful soft piece and play it and follow it with the 1812 overture, which begins very, very softly. But once you get done with that big canon at the end, where do you go from there? And what do you do?
How do you follow that?
Impossible to match that.
True.
Sometimes I'll just be fairly rowdy for a while, end with something like that, and then bring in something soft. Palate cleanser, move along to something new. And with things like the 1812 overture, I always feel most comfortable ending an hour with it because I just feel like, now what?
Yeah.
You know, you just, not much you can do after that. Move on.
Well, that takes a ton of time for you. And how long in advance do you work on building your broadcast year, for instance?
We're trying to look at the year as a whole thing. What anniversaries are coming up? We just had David Diamond's 100th.
Oh, yes.
What kind of programming are we going to have? Do we have a special day? Is it Black History Month? Women's History Month? We have been looking at trying to do some little initiatives. So not this summer, but last summer, I had a week that was cartoons at noon in June. And for the Bach 330, I know that a lot of the choral groups did a whole lot of work around that Bach 330, so that came up. So we built up to that, and what we decided to do for that actually was called the Bach's Lunch. and every day was nothing but Bach, and it was a different facet of Bach in each day. So one day was the cantata day. One day was the Brandenburg day.
Yes.
You know, and it all culminated with Jeremy Danks doing his Goldberg variations.
That's brilliant.
That was the end of it. So we are looking at interesting initiatives that catch the ear and people will enjoy. We're looking at the big events that are going to be happening.
Yes.
And we're looking at also sound quality. I know when I'm booking Backstage Pass, I look at that so that we're not always getting the string quartet. We need something new, something different each time. I mean, you do this with the Rochester Oratorio
Right, there's
Society.
contrast built in, you know, contrasting speeds, contrasting keys, contrasting timbres.
Right. And that's why, again, I listen to everything. So that I like to think of when I'm programming a show, and I train people like this, to think of it as a sine curve. Up and down. So it goes faster and slower, quieter, softer. If you actually listen to a rock station, you know, they're booking along and all of a sudden there's the beautiful ballad. And everything slows down a little and then it picks up. And so I think of programming the same way.
Right.
But that's where I started. I started with a rock station. And then I did jazz. So when I walked into classical, I started programming the same way.
I see. So now, I think people don't understand the level of planning that you have to invest in making a satisfying sequence of music during the day. That means they might tune in during the 20 minutes of their commute or something and hear this style of piece. So are there certain times of day that are sort of the cash register? You know they're going to be in their car, or they're getting ready for work, or? Well,
that's what drive time is. So there's that generally the big ones are going to be morning.
Yes.
And then afternoon when people are driving home. Middays tend to be a little more sedate. And so middays I sometimes kick up the jams a little more, have a little more fun. But you know, listenership is changing because people can now stream on their computers at work.
I see.
And so when you have that dip in the day, a lot of that's leveling out because people are hopping out of their cars.
Yes.
They're going in, they're booting up their computer, and they're streaming all day long off their computer.
I know that's personally, I know that's true, yes. Mm-hmm.
And so how people listen to music and where they listen to music is so different now.
Right. So as a music director, you have the end listener in mind all the time, just the way a performer does, for instance, on doing recitals or concerts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we've had some wonderful announcers who have come in who are performers.
Yes.
And when I talk to them, I'll say, think of your show as a big recital.
Okay.
Think of it as a 4-hour recital.
Yes.
What kind of sentence do you want to make? What kind of, how do you want this to sound for your audience? And what kind of journey do you want to take your audience on?
Because it is a time sequence, and you can take
is.
them emotionally from one place to another.
It is.
That's brilliant.
And so, you know, if I'm playing the Lark Ascending, you must be very careful about how you walk into that and how you walk out of that.
I see.
So there's a Facebook page. It's closed, so no one can get in, but it's a lot of music programmers, classical music programmers around the nation, and we all talk. And it's really interesting for me to hear what other people have difficulty programming. And a lot of them are very similar. People have very similar thoughts about what programs up well, what doesn't program up well. But I also say this to the announcers as they're training and as they're working. You can't think of who you are, where you are, and what you're doing. You have to think about who's listening, where they are, and what they're doing. You know, if you're doing the early morning shift, and heaven knows I've done a few of those, you might be wide awake at 6:45, 7 o'clock in the morning. Your listener is not. So you have to remember that. Likewise, if you're working at 10 o'clock at night, you might be wide awake, but your listener is probably not wanting to be wide awake or looking to wind down the day. So you have to be really sensitive. The overnight shifts are fascinating. Back in the day when I did overnight shifts, because those are the shifts where people are listening to you because they have to. And you know, they are working. They are insomniacs. They work. They're coming home from a late shift. They've been out partying, but they're listening to you because they have to. And those are very special. That's a very special and interesting shift to do. You'd think late night was all going to be gentle music. Not necessarily.
It can be edgy.
Yeah.
It can be edgy.
I think so.
So now you talk about your listeners as though they're people you know, and in Rochester, in this area, we're very fortunate in that we really do know our listeners, both in the concert scene and in the radio scene, and the community supports everything very robustly. And but WXXI has a much wider reach. How much do you hear from people elsewhere about your programming?
Constantly.
Constantly.
Constantly. And as the number of classical stations have decreased, the number of times we're hearing from people from other markets has increased.
I was going to ask you, who is the benchmark for WXXI? I mean, for the size of community, is there another station that you're basically on a par with, or that you pay attention to in particular?
No. Honestly, no. We pay attention to all the stations. We talk to each other because no matter the size of the city, the community stays the same. The type of person who listens to public broadcasting and classical music on public broadcasting is very similar from city to city. And whether it's in South Carolina or Portland, Oregon, or New York City or Rochester, New York, the style of person who's tuned in to each of our stations is remarkably similar in their likes, in their dislikes, in their belief systems. So where things change is what a community likes. Our community, for example, loves vocals.
Is that so?
We have an awful lot of choruses. We have an awful lot of people who sing in those choruses.
True.
And this is a community, and we have the Eastman.
I see.
With all those fabulous singers. So this market is far more tolerant of vocal and classical, or vocal and opera.
I see.
Than other other places might be.
Uh-huh.
This area also kind of digs early music.
Ah.
There are places where that is anathema to listening.
Is that...
Do not put the shawm on.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to hear the sackbut. So, but that's the tweaking.
I see.
That's where you tweak according to what people want.
And have you learned that through a measurement of some kind or anecdotally from your listeners? How have you...
It's a lot of it is anecdotal.
Uh-huh.
And then you really get an eyeful when you ask for the top 40.
I see.
And
Uh-huh.
you start seeing, and you know, there are always little surprises here and there
Uh-huh.
that crop up. Mirror and Mirror, Spiegel and Spiegel by Arvo Pärt showed up in our top 40. Who'd have thought? Because, you know, I was told by somebody who's I'm consultant that spare modern things don't go well with the audience, and yet Mirror and Mirror, Spiegel and Spiegel, huge hit with our audience. And in fact, I think our audience actually kind of, in smaller doses, likes those spare things.
Uh-huh. So when you say classical music, are you working to bring people to the appreciation of classical music too? Is there an education factor to your programming?
The number one thing you need to know is that when you're on the air, you're half of a conversation.
Yes, I see.
It's not sitting there and holding forth. I mean, this is not unlike the old days in opera where, you know, it was the stand and deliver, you know, and that's it. Now you have to act. Now you have to actually interact with your fellow people. And so the old day of sitting behind a mic and just the stentorian holding forth thing is done. You should be conversational. You should be half of a conversation. So the number one thing I tell people is to bring in a photograph of somebody they really like. Put it up on the reader stand in front of them. And actually talk to that picture. Back in the day, when I was doing rock radio, I was taught how to do this. There's always glass windows, and I would look at my reflection and just talk to my reflection, but talk to somebody on a one-on-one.
Oh, yes.
And then you get that personal touch, that feeling, people get that feeling that you are talking directly to that person, which you are. So, you know, things like, all of you out there must be having a great time. You know, unless you're talking to a party, you're talking to a person. That's the number one thing that I teach them.
I see.
Is that personal thing. Be personal, be concise.
And how about a lot of language in broadcasting? They have to speak everything from Czech to Spanish to Polish to pronounce a lot of different nationalities.
Don't need to know the language, just need to use that pronouncer book that we've got.
Oh, yeah, there's a guide.
We have a guide.
A style guide.
So the style guide so that people can actually get through it. But this is a very interesting conversation that happens in classical music, and that is, how much are we going to translate?
Yes. Yeah.
And so nobody says the French name to Afternoon of a Faun, prelude to an afternoon on an afternoon of a faun. Nobody says that anymore. But we do say La Mer.
I see.
So there's an awful lot of, you know, we don't call it Deutsches Requiem. We call it the German Requiem. So there's a lot of translation that is going on. And I think, especially when you start talking about arias, I think more needs to happen, because I think that's kind of off-putting. You know, here I am with my fancy schmancy Italian pronunciation that I'm going to say just so beautifully. Just tell me the name of the aria.
Right. So there's an elitism thing and an accessibility thing. You want people to just be able to enjoy the programming, enjoy the music.
There's a real thought that somehow you have to be a genius and an expert and you know, some kind of cultural maven to get classical music, and you don't. It's just beautiful music.
It's just beautiful music.
It's just beautiful music. And I think, you know, there's always this fear of old people listen to classical music. How do we get the kids in? And I'm not sure you just get the kids in. I think there comes a moment in our lives where there's just too much noise, and this is better.
That's a fascinating.
And, you know, I have a friend, and he's a policeman. And he sent me a text and said, "I'm thinking of listening to some classical music. Can you help?" it came out of the blue.
Huh.
This was totally not his bailiwick at all.
Right.
You know, he's a policeman who rides motorcycles. And I said, sure. And I brought him a sampler of the great stuff, the Fifth and the Seventh of Beethoven, Symphonie Fantastique, the Four Seasons,
Yeah.
you know, even Pachelbel's Canon. I gave him sort of that overview of the hits. And he downloaded all of this, he listened to all of this, and he's now buying albums, and he's often got a Spotify stream on, listening to classical music. He's really becoming an informed listener.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And it's all based on what he likes to hear.
Oh, well, you've changed a lot of lives with your work on the radio and work with Backstage Pass, and you've won a lot of well-deserved awards. Thank you so much for being our guest today, Julia.
It's been an honor and a pleasure,
It's
Eric.
wonderful to have you here. My guest has been Julia Figueras, music director of 91.5, Classical 91.5, WXXI Public Broadcasting, and it's just been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.